That gray morning, the sky seemed to be sharing in the sorrow of those gathered at Hannah's funeral, a woman beloved by the entire village. No one spoke, only the soft wind rustled the leaves in the trees, as if nature itself were bowing in farewell. But then, amidst the stillness, a sound broke the silence. A sudden, urgent barking. It was Rex, the loyal dog who had been by Hannah's side for many years. No one expected that an animal could draw every gaze during such a solemn ceremony. Rex was not just a dog. He was a companion, a shadow that had followed Hannah everywhere. And now, standing before her casket, he refused to stay silent. Rex barked relentlessly, his eyes locked onto the coffin. It wasn't the aggressive bark of a hostile dog. It was the sound of a warning, of desperation. As if he were trying to tell everyone something urgent that only he knew. Inside the chapel, people began exchanging glances. Concerned, someone whispered, "What does he see?" Some grew uneasy. Others simply stood frozen, eyes fixed on Rex. What was strange was that this dog was known to be intelligent. In the village, everyone had heard tales about his uncanny abilities. As if he could sense things that humans could not. Children whispered spooky stories about dogs that could see spirits. The adults started to feel a chill crawl down their spines. Still, Rex kept barking, but he wasn't barking at random. He stared only at the coffin, never taking his eyes off it. A few of the adults stepped forward, trying to calm Rex. "Easy now, quiet," they whispered, but Rex didn't listen. He backed up a step, adopting a posture that looked more like he was guarding something, or trying to block someone from getting closer. At that moment, Father Daly, the priest leading the service, also took notice. Standing at the altar, he seemed briefly unsettled. Now, every gaze shifted from Rex to him. In a single moment, no one said a word. And on Father Daly's face, a flicker of unease surfaced, a moment he couldn't hide. He tried to regain composure, gave a slight shrug. "It's just a dog," he said softly, attempting a smile to reassure the crowd. But that smile trembled, uneasy, forced, and Rex still barked. Not out of fear, not in defiance, but as if to warn them of something they were not ready to see. The commotion caused by Rex had stripped the funeral of its initial solemnity. Whispers began to ripple outward like small waves lapping at the shore. Some were curious, some were worried, but all eyes were fixed in the same direction, where Rex still stood, unwavering, eyes locked onto the coffin. Father Daly, despite his efforts to remain composed, was now visibly unsettled. He wiped sweat from his brow, his gaze flickering around the chapel, as if searching for something, anything, to anchor him amid the crowd's suspicious stares. He stepped forward toward Rex, his voice softening like he was soothing a child. "Now, Rex, calm down, my boy, everything is all right." But Rex would not calm down. He backed away, letting out a low growl. Not out of anger, but out of resistance. His eyes stayed fixed on the white flowered coffin. People began to sense that something wasn't right. Even the non-believers found themselves swallowing hard as they took in the strange, escalating scene. "He's scared," an elderly woman whispered. Father Daly's hands, they never shake like that. Rex remained focused, and his actions, his defiance, felt like a different kind of ritual unfolding in parallel with the funeral. A ritual meant to summon a truth long buried. Just then, a stranger among the mourners stepped forward. He didn't look like a villager. Stern face, piercing eyes, and a presence that commanded attention. His name was David, a man who had recently moved to the area. Rumors said he was a former civilian investigator, but no one truly knew much about him. David knelt down, gently placing a hand on Rex's head. Strangely, Rex stopped barking for a moment, as if he had finally found someone who understood him. "Good boy," David whispered. "Now tell me, is there something in there?" He turned back, eyes fixed on the coffin, the very place everyone else had tried not to look at. "Wait," Father Daly cut in, his voice sharp and panicked. "What are you doing? This is a funeral, not a stage for some performance." David didn't answer. His eyes never left the coffin, the same place Rex had stared at all along. "It's not me performing," David said slowly. "It's the dog, and he wants us to take a closer look." The air turned still, like something ancient had just been summoned. The silence swallowed the chapel whole. Only the wind remained, whispering through frosted stained glass windows, slipping between the long wooden pews where the congregation still sat in stunned stillness. Unsure how to react, Rex let out a low, guttural growl. It wasn't rage. It was something deeper, a sound burdened with grief, with unease, a warning soaked in sorrow. David slowly rose to his feet. His expression was ice. His voice, calm, clear, turned toward Father Daly, who now clutched his Bible as if it were the last shield against a truth clawing its way to the surface. "Father Daly," David began, not loud, but loud enough that every person in that chapel heard it. "Please tell me, how did Hannah die?" The question fell like a stone into a still pond, sending ripples no one could stop. Whispers erupted. Gasps. A man in the front row leaned toward his wife and whispered, Wasn't she supposed to have died in her sleep?" Father Daly froze. He blinked rapidly, his hands now trembling over the worn leather cover of his Bible. I already told you," he stammered. "I was the first to find her. She passed peacefully in her sleep. A quiet death. No pain." David didn't move, didn't raise his voice, but his next words cut like a scalpel. "Then why was she alone? Why were you the first at the scene? Who told you to go there? Who declared her dead? And why is there no medical report?" Each question hit like a hammer. Cracks formed across the mask of piety Father Daly had worn for decades. He flushed, then turned pale. Sweat beaded and poured down his temples. And for the briefest moment, in a flash too fast for most to register, his eyes revealed pure fear. The look of a cornered animal. The look of a man who knows the truth has just walked in, with a bark. "You're insulting the dead," he snapped, his voice high and quivering. "And insulting me, a man who stood by her for decades." David didn't flinch. Rex stood by his side, growling low, his eyes locked on the priest. "Then allow me," David said, his voice steady as stone, "to ask one final time, in front of every soul in this house of God." He paused, then spoke each word slowly, like striking nails into the marble beneath their feet. "Are you sure Hannah died of natural causes? Or was she silenced because she knew too much?" A cry burst from the back of the chapel. Someone sobbed openly. An elderly man clutched his cane, shaking his head in disbelief. This was no longer a funeral. This was a reckoning. Father Daly slammed his hand down onto the pulpit. "Get out of here, now." But no one moved. No one came to escort David away. Because in that moment, no one wanted him to stop. They wanted him to keep going. David stood silently in the center of the chapel, his gaze locked onto Father Daly, who, despite still wearing his pristine white vestments, now looked less like a holy figure and more like a statue on the verge of collapse. Beside him, Rex stood motionless, but his eyes glinted, not like those of a dog, but of something older, wiser, a sentinel, a guardian of something sacred and dangerous. "Father Daly," David said, his voice low but unwavering, "I didn't come here to cause conflict." He paused. "I came because Rex brought me here." Every head turned toward the dog. It was just a dog. And yet, in that moment, Rex no longer looked like a mere companion. He was a witness, a protector, a gatekeeper between truth and everything buried beneath it. Father Daly's hands clenched tight. His eyes scanned the congregation, searching for support, but the way they looked at him now was different. No longer blind faith, no longer unquestioning reverence, but a new expression rising across every face. Suspicion and fear. "You're an outsider," Father Daly shouted, his voice cracking. "You don't know Hannah. You don't know this parish." David said nothing. He simply walked down the aisle, past worn pews, beneath faded icons whose colors had long been dimmed by time. And without looking at the priest, he said, "Maybe I didn't know her, but I know what silence sounds like, when it's hiding something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a faded photograph. The edges were brittle, the surface yellowed. In the image, Hannah and Father Daly, standing in front of this very church. But what made people whisper, what made the air shift, was the small metal box at the base of the statue behind them. A box that Hannah had mentioned in a letter, discovered hidden beneath a tablecloth in her kitchen. David raised the photo. "This is what Hannah was investigating. And I believe she didn't die of old age." Gasps filled the chapel. A middle-aged woman suddenly broke into sobs. Her voice trembled. I saw her light still on past midnight that night. Brighter than usual. Then the next morning, she was just gone. An elderly man added, voice barely above a whisper. Hannah told me, if anything happened to her, to check the Bible by her bed. But when I came, it was gone. Father Daly staggered back. His lips tightened. His brow soaked in sweat. His eyes darted, wild and cornered. Then, Rex let out a short, piercing howl. The kind that splits air. The kind that remembers blood. He stepped away from David and moved slowly toward the pulpit. Nose low. Breathing steady. He began sniffing at the edge of the crimson rug beneath the altar. The very rug Father Daly had stood on. David followed silently. He knelt. Rex scratched. Once. Twice. Clink. A metallic sound rang beneath the floor. Every breath caught. David gently lifted the edge of the rug. Beneath it, a single wooden panel, perfectly fitted. And embedded in it, a rusted iron lock. David didn't look up. He didn't have to. His voice was steady. Final. And here, he said, his eyes never leaving Father Daly, is where we start to uncover the truth. The entire church fell into a deep silence. All eyes were fixed on the spot where David knelt, where the red carpet had been pulled back to reveal a wooden hatch sealed with a rusted lock. Rex sat beside him, gaze still locked on Father Daly, as if the dog alone now stood guard over a truth that refused to stay buried. David reached out and touched the lock. Old, corroded, but intact. From his coat pocket, he retrieved a small key, the one he'd found hidden behind one of Hannah's framed photos in her house. A key hidden not with fear, but with intent. It fit. Click. A soft but final sound, like the gavel drop of a judgment long delayed. David slowly lifted the wooden hatch. A rush of damp, stale air swept upward, thick with the scent of stone, decay, and time. Beneath them, a narrow wooden staircase descending into blackness. The light from the chapel could not reach the bottom. Does anyone know this place exists? David asked, raising his voice. No answer. Some villagers shook their heads. They had been born here, lived their whole lives here, prayed here every week, but not one of them had ever heard of a cellar beneath the church. David turned on his flashlight. He looked at Rex. Come on, boy. And they went down. Each step creaked. The sound echoed, hollow, endless, across stone walls that hadn't heard voices in years. David moved slowly. Rex walked beside him, every movement tight and measured. At the bottom of the stairs, a narrow hallway, carved from rock. The walls were wet, laced with moss. The air, cold as the grave. At the end of the hall, a metal door. It wasn't locked, just closed. David pushed it open. Inside, a small room. Low ceiling. One flickering yellow bulb overhead. And in the middle, a heavy wooden table, stacked with boxes, sealed envelopes, and a thick, leather-bound journal. David opened the journal. Inside, pages of handwritten notes, messy, frantic, and damning. Dates, names, sums of money, parishioners' names, matched with coded amounts. But what turned David's blood to ice were the banking receipts tucked between the pages. Accounts, transactions, wire transfers, and the name tied to every deposit? Daly, M. Then, footsteps. David turned sharply. At the top of the stairs, descending slowly, stood Father Daly. He was no longer wearing his vestments. His face was pale as ash. But in his eyes, something hot, burning, not guilt, but rage and despair. You've gone too far, David, the priest said softly, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. David said nothing. He stepped between the table and the priest. Rex moved with him, standing firm, growling low. Where's Hannah? David asked. His voice was cold, precise. Father Daly didn't answer. He just laughed, soft, broken. She shouldn't have looked so deep, he murmured. She found too much. And now, so have you. David clenched his fists. Then I'll dig deeper. He crouched, opening a small drawer beneath the table, locked. But David had another key. The second one, the one hidden in Hannah's curtain hem. It clicked open. Inside, a stack of photographs. But one photo stopped his breath. Hannah, tied to a chair in a stone room. Alive, eyes wide, terrified. David froze, his chest constricted. She was still alive. Father Daly stepped into the room, one step at a time. But Rex moved between them. His fur bristled, his eyes blazing red with fury. No growl now, just silence. The silence before an attack. And in that moment, David no longer sounded like an investigator. He sounded like a judge. His voice echoed through the room like the toll of a funeral bell. You buried your conscience in this place. But today, the truth comes back into the light. On that dim, gray morning, the sky seemed to mourn with those gathered at the church. And by nightfall, it bore silent witness to a different kind of reckoning. Father Daly froze, as if measuring the distance between himself and David, between what had been hidden and what now demanded to be seen. Rex remained between them, unmoving, his body tense but controlled, his eyes fixed on the black robes of the priest, robes that now looked more like a funeral shroud for a sin never confessed. What did you do to Hannah? David repeated. This time, it wasn't a question, it was an indictment. The priest slumped down onto the stone steps, shoulders caving in like a puppet whose strings had finally snapped. His eyes, once full of command, now held only exhaustion. Hannah was good, he began, voice trembling. Too good. She thought everything could be fixed, even me. David took a step closer. But not too close. He let the beam of the flashlight shine directly onto a face that time, and guilt, had long ago eroded. I made a mistake, Father Daly continued. A long time ago, I realized I could reroute the church's money, hide it beneath blind faith. And she saw it. She didn't stay silent. He lowered his head. I never meant to hurt her. Just to keep her quiet for a while. Until things blew over. But she kept writing. Letters, photos, evidence. And when you arrived, his voice broke. I knew I had lost. David sifted through the photographs and damning records on the desk. Then turned to the final page of the journal. There, scrawled hastily in fading black ink. Old cemetery. Angel statue. Broken wing. Underground vault. David turned to Rex. Come on, old friend. We're out of time. Behind them, Father Daly rose. His voice was leaden. I won't stop you. I've kept her too long. They left the church basement in silence, carrying a stack of evidence. A leather-bound journal. And a storm of truth ready to break. Outside, the wind howled as they crossed the village graveyard. Every step sounded like the sighs of unseen souls. And under the pale moonlight, the broken-winged angel came into view. The statue children feared and elders ignored. David knelt, brushing away the moss and dirt until he found it, a small iron hatch. Just wide enough for a person to crawl through. He wedged it open with a crowbar. The groaning of rusted hinges echoed like a scream across the tombstones. A narrow stone staircase spiraled into darkness. Rex went first. No barking, no growling, only sharp sniffs, purposeful steps, as if he'd known this path all along. David followed, flashlight slicing through the black. The air grew heavy, thick with earth, time, and silence. At the end of the corridor, a metal door, rusted, with a faded wooden sign nailed across it, offering storage, unauthorized entry prohibited. David tried the handle, locked. From his coat, he pulled the key he'd taken from Hannah's tin box. It fit. The door creaked open. Inside, a tiny, suffocating room, silent as a tomb, and in the center, a wooden chair, and a woman, bound at the wrists and ankles, head slumped forward, long hair covering her face. Hannah, David gasped. His heart stopped. He rushed forward, untying the ropes. Gently, he held her frail body. She stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, cloudy at first, then clear, like someone waking from a nightmare that had lasted too long. David, she whispered. I knew you'd come. Rex pressed against her legs, letting out a soft, keening sound, a reunion between old allies. David held her tighter. Out there, they're waiting for you, he said, and so is the truth. And under the flickering beam of a single flashlight, they climbed out of the crypt, not just with a woman saved, but with a torch ready to set fire to the lies that had stayed buried far too long. As David guided Hannah out of the cold, narrow tomb beneath the cemetery, the moonlight above seemed to soften, casting a gentle glow upon three survivors, a man, a frail woman, and a loyal dog whose steps no longer crept with caution, but moved with quiet certainty, like a hero who knew he had been right. The hatch behind them closed with a hollow thud. There was no need to lock it. The truth had been opened, and it would never be buried again. As they crossed back into the village square, a crowd had already gathered, drawn by whispers, by instinct, and by the knowledge that something had changed. Flashlights glimmered, phones flickered, faces were pale, stunned, yet hopeful, and then someone gasped aloud at the sight of Hannah, gaunt. Yes, but alive, her eyes flickering with a flame that refused to die. It's her. It's really her. An elderly woman dropped her handkerchief as her knees buckled. David helped Hannah stand tall and pointed back toward the church. The truth is in there, he said clearly, loudly, in the room beneath the statue, in the box I found. And in the voice Hannah almost never lived to speak. The words sparked a murmur that swept through the crowd like wind through dry grass. People turned toward the church, that sacred structure they once trusted with everything, their sins, their weddings, their dead. Now it loomed like a ruined temple, its silence complicit in every lie. And then, from the distance, Father Daly emerged. His white robes were torn. His face was bruised, his eyes hollow like someone stumbling from a dreamless night. His hands were bound, not by violence, but by truth, tied by the same villagers who had once knelt to confess before him. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. He didn't speak. He simply bowed his head. A child clutched their mother's hand and whispered, "Mom, why did Father Daly do bad things?" The mother didn't answer. She just held her child tighter, her eyes drifting to Hannah, as though searching for a new kind of faith. David stepped forward, opening the metal box for all to see. Inside, stacks of bills, labeled with the names of every family present. Beneath them, a small key, and the map to the underground vault. "This," David said, voice unwavering, "is the truth, not just the stolen money, but the betrayal of a man who was meant to guard your souls." The people stood silent, their hearts pounding. A middle-aged man clenched his fists. "He kidnapped Hannah?" David nodded. "Because she knew too much. And she almost died to keep you from being deceived." Beside him, Hannah lifted her head. Her lips were dry, her voice no more than a breath, but it carried. "I never wanted to destroy your faith," she said. "I just wanted it to be real." And in the silence that followed, came applause. It started slow, a few hands. Then more. Not because Hannah was a victim, but because she had survived. Because she had chosen to speak. Because from that moment on, they would no longer place their belief in a man, but in each other. Rex let out a single bark, not urgent, not warning, but solemn. A declaration. It's not over, but it's begun again. That night, Hannah was brought home. David stayed by her side, with Rex curled at the door, like three spirits who could not yet rest. Still tethered by a story whose final chapter had yet to be written. And in that small room, beneath the dim flicker of a single lamp, David turned the pages of Hannah's worn journal. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed. There, in faded ink, between names and dates, a line, a confession, a shadow, something Hannah hadn't yet told him. Something older, darker, and still buried. The small room where Hannah now rested had turned unnaturally quiet. The flickering oil lamp on the desk cast a dim amber glow across the slanted cursive lines in her journal. Lines David was reading for the first time. Start to finish. Rex lay beneath Hannah's bed, head resting on his front paws, eyes half open, standing guard not by command, but by instinct. David sat by the window, back against the wooden frame. The night wind crept through the cracked boards, cool against his skin. Yet the words rising from Hannah's journal were making sweat bead cold on his brow. They weren't just skimming donations. They were a group, a hidden circle. They met under the full moon. After the final prayer, I saw them enter the storeroom beneath the church, but no one came back out the front. David froze, eyes widening. Father Daly wasn't acting alone. I overheard names. Elias, Barton, even Old Man Holden, the cemetery keeper. They used code names. I don't know what they were doing, but I heard singing. A kind of chant. Dark, haunting, unlike any worship I've ever known. On the bed, Hannah began to breathe faster, her chest rising and falling erratically, as if her body were reliving something in its sleep. David moved to her side and gently took her hand. "Do you still remember what they did during those ceremonies?" he asked softly. Hannah nodded faintly. Her eyes remained closed, but her voice trembled into the room like wind slipping under a locked door. "They weren't praying to God. They were serving something else. David went still. A chill ran up his spine like the stroke of a cold hand. He turned to the next page. I wanted to tell someone. But every time I left my house, I felt eyes on me. A man in dark glasses and a wide-brimmed hat. I'm writing this in case I'm silenced. They're hiding among us, not to preach, but to control. Outside, the wind suddenly rose into a shrieking gust. Rex sprang up, growling low at the front door. David stuffed the journal into his coat, grabbed a flashlight, and moved quickly toward the entrance. Hannah pushed herself upright on the bed. Rex had already taken his place at her side, standing between her and the door like a silent wall. Then came the sound, faint but unmistakable, of footsteps in the yard. David extinguished the lamp with a sharp twist and motion for silence. A shadow passed the window. Then, a click. The doorknob jiggled. Someone was testing it. David opened the door a sliver. Breath held. No one. Only a scrap of paper, caught in the wind, fluttered against the porch step. He bent down and picked it up. Red ink, scrawled in jagged lines. Stop. The second is never allowed to live. David looked up. Nothing but darkness. Yet the weight of unseen eyes crushed the air around the house like a vice. He shut the door, bolted it tight, and turned back. Hannah was now sitting upright, eyes locked on his. I've heard them speak of the second before, she whispered. If I was the first to uncover the secret, then the second is the one who brings it all down. David, they're talking about you. Silence dropped like a trap. David didn't answer at first. He lowered himself into the old chair, his eyes fixed on the message in his hand. Rex placed one paw on David's knee, grounding him. Then David spoke, calm and steady. Then they're right. I will be the one who brings the last wall crashing down. In that moment, between the dense darkness beyond the window and the golden glow inside the fragile room, something changed. This was no longer an investigation. No longer the story of a woman rescued. This was a war, a final reckoning, against something that had survived in shadows. For far too long, the night crept toward midnight, and the village slumbered under a blanket of silence. But the flickering glow from Hannah's small wooden cabin still burned brightly, a lone ember in the dark. Inside, David had laid out a faded map of the church found in her journal. Rex sat close beside him, ears perked, eyes wide. The hidden vault is beneath the Western Saint's statue. David murmured, from the main cellar. You have to turn a carved stone with an alpha symbol. That's the trigger. Hannah nodded, her face pale but resolute. I used to hear footsteps underground, on full moon nights. No one was allowed to stay after evening mass. Except Father Daly. David looked up at her. And now it's time I go down. Alone. No. Hannah began to rise, but David caught her gently by the hand. You need to stay. If something happens, Rex will protect you. And you'll be the one to tell the village the truth. As if understanding every word, Rex nuzzled against Hannah, letting out a low, steady growl, a vow, not a warning. David knelt down, hugging the dog tightly. Keep her safe. I trust you. He slipped quietly into the night, weaving through narrow paths that led to the church. Moonlight was veiled behind heavy clouds, draping everything in a gray, uneasy dusk. The church loomed ahead, a dark monolith in the distance. The heavy oak door groaned softly as it opened. David slipped inside, flashlight in hand, casting thin beams across the long rows of pews. He headed straight for the western statue. Beneath it, carved into a large stone at its base, was the Alpha, a symbol etched with eerie precision. David placed both hands on the stone and turned it. His heart thundered in his chest. A sharp click echoed through the silence. The statue trembled slightly. Then, it shifted, revealing a hidden spiral staircase descending into the earth. He took a breath, tightened his grip on the flashlight, and stepped down. The air below was damp, frigid, and thick with the scent of mold. Stone walls, veined with moss, closed in on either side. The brick floor groaned beneath each footfall. At the end of the corridor stood a heavy iron door. With trembling fingers, David inserted the key he'd recovered from the donation box. The lock clicked open. The door creaked inward. Inside was a small chamber lit only by his beam. A wooden altar sat at the center, but no cross adorned it. Instead, a grotesque wooden effigy stood there, its hollow eyes set with black stones. Around the room, Latin inscriptions were scrawled in dried red ink, twisting along the walls like veins. David's breath caught. To the right, he spotted a table cluttered with papers, maps, names, and financial ledgers. In the far corner sat a rusted iron chest. Then came the sound, a whisper of movement behind him. David spun around. Father Daly. He stood at the edge of the chamber, a lit candle trembling in one hand. His face was ghostly pale, his eyes wild with a madness that had long outlived its host. "You shouldn't be here, David," he said, his voice disturbingly calm. "You don't understand what you're touching." David stood tall, unwavering. "I know enough. Hannah's alive. You kidnapped her to silence her. I've seen the money, the journals, this room." Father Daly smiled, thin and crooked. "They won't believe you. They never have. Here, I am their faith." David stepped forward, his gaze locked on the priest. "Not after tonight." The priest set the candle on the altar, then turned and opened the iron chest. From within, he pulled a folder of documents, photographs, fake banking records, counterfeit receipts, and a map leading to a second hidden chamber behind the cemetery. "You think I kept these out of forgetfulness?" he muttered. "I kept them because I knew, someday, someone would come poking, but I've always been ready." David raised the small recorder in his hand. "So have I." Then came the bark, sharp, loud, echoing down the stone steps. Rex. Rapid footsteps followed. Hannah had arrived, with Rex at her side. David turned to the door. "It's over." Father Daly staggered backward, his eyes wide with panic. And in that moment, under the flickering flash of the flashlight, David understood. He was standing at the source, the very root of the corruption that had cast a shadow over this village for decades. But this was not the end. This was the beginning of a long unearthing, of truth, no longer buried. The air in the underground chamber had turned dense and still, as though frozen in time. Rex growled deeply, stepping forward slowly, placing himself firmly between Hannah and Father Daly. The flashlight beam from David's hand lit up the priest's face, a face now beaded with sweat, yet still brimming with defiance. "This is where you kept Hannah," David said coldly, "where you hid the money, and where you tried to bury the truth. No one believes you anymore." Father Daly suddenly let out a low, bitter laugh. "You think exposing me ends everything?" He backed against the wall, clutching a dark wooden crucifix from the altar like a last, desperate relic. "I am not just a priest. I am history. I am the keeper of law. When the law collapses, faith collapses with it." David took a step forward. "No, you're a man who used faith to hide sin. And now the very people who believed in you will be the ones to rise against you." Hannah looked around the damp, mold-stained chamber, horror glinting in her eyes. She stepped to the wooden table, hands trembling as she flipped through the documents, donation lists, bank transfers to anonymous accounts. "Every penny from the villagers. You sold it for a lie," she whispered. David placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "We'll bring it all into the light. Tonight." Father Daly stared at them, the gaze of a man who once ruled from the pulpit but now stood naked before judgment. In a flash, he bolted, rushing toward the exit of the chamber. But Rex was faster. The dog lunged, growling fiercely, blocking the priest's path. Father Daly stumbled back toward the altar, wild-eyed. "Hannah, call the police. Tell them to come to the church. We have enough," David commanded. She nodded and fumbled her phone from her coat pocket, her fingers still shaking. But just as she dialed, the flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness consumed the room. Rushed footsteps echoed through the chamber, frantic, fleeing. Rex barked in warning. David Dove grabbed the fallen flashlight and flicked it back on just in time to see Father Daly scrambling up a narrow crawlway behind a shelf, leading to the church's rear exit. "No!" Hannah shouted. David sprinted after him, with Rex tearing ahead. Footsteps thudded against stone, breath and barks reverberating down the narrow corridor. The side hatch burst open. Father Daly dashed across the rear cemetery, his tattered vestments fluttering like a ghost in the wind. But his steps faltered, blood dripped from where Rex had bitten him, and he collapsed face first into the earth. David caught up and pinned him down. "It's over," he said. "You have nowhere left to run." Police lights glowed in the distance, flashing red and blue swirls painting the trees. Sirens cut through the morning fog like a verdict. handcuffed and hauled away. Father Daly passed through a crowd of villagers now swarming the churchyard, faces twisted with rage. Betrayal. Disbelief. Hannah stood firm, the file of evidence in her hand, undeniable proof of everything he'd done. She stood next to David and Rex, a survivor risen from the dead, carrying the truth that had been buried for too long. An old man shuffled forward and whispered, "Father Daly meant everything to us. But now I see. He was just a robe covering a lie." David nodded, his eyes fixed on the church, now slowly emerging in the soft gray light of dawn. "Sometimes truth has to be clawed from the earth," he said quietly. "But once it rises, it can never be buried again." Rex barked softly, not out of fear or alarm, but in agreement. No one doubted the dog anymore. No one dismissed its bark as nuisance. It had been the first voice of justice. And thanks to it, everything had changed. The morning sun had fully risen by the time the police sealed off the church and the hidden chamber beneath it. David sat beside Hannah on the front steps of the chapel. Rex curled at their feet, his eyes open, alert, but at peace. Though still fatigued, Hannah had shed the heaviest burden of her life. She turned to David, her voice faint but resolute. "Thank you. If it weren't for you, and Rex, I might have never made it back." David smiled gently, his hand resting on Rex's head. "I just did what anyone should do when they hear a cry for help. Even if that cry is a bark." They shared a quiet laugh, then turned their gaze toward the village square. People were gathered, not in celebration or joy, but in bewildered silence. The arrest of Father Daly was not what shook them most. It was the realization that they had trusted the wrong man for so many years. Some cried, others said nothing, a few began to argue. An elderly woman approached David, her hand trembling as she placed it on his shoulder. "You've opened our eyes. This village needs rebuilding. But first, we owe an apology." David shook his head softly. "There's no need to apologize for believing in goodness. Just make sure that after today, no one gets deceived again." In the days that followed, the town entered a new era, uncertain, but not without hope. A formal statement from the authorities confirmed the truth. Father Daly had embezzled hundreds of thousands in donation funds over the past decade, creating secret slush accounts for undisclosed purposes. The unlawful imprisonment of Hannah was ruled a criminal act, masked under layers of faith and authority. David became a familiar name, whispered with gratitude and reverence across the village. People sought him out, for answers, for thanks, and sometimes for forgiveness, but he never claimed the title of hero. Quietly, he continued assisting police investigations, helping track down others who might have been involved. Hannah was taken to the hospital for a full health evaluation. In the early days, she barely slept, nightmares lingered. But each morning, when she opened her eyes and saw Rex curled beside her bed, she knew she was alive and protected. A week later, the church sent someone new, a senior female priest named Mary. Her eyes carried sadness, but also steady wisdom, a woman shaped by loss, by endurance. During her first service, she stood before the congregation, not to preach, but to bow her head in silence. "I did not come to instruct," she said gently. "I came to listen, because sometimes, even those who wear the cloth, need forgiveness too." The crowd said nothing, but heads nodded in quiet understanding. That service wasn't just a prayer for Hannah's peace. It was the beginning of something new. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the western hills, David stood at the edge of the graveyard, the place where it had all begun. Rex sat beside him, ears perked as though listening to the wind whisper through the old stone cross. David placed a hand on a new plaque near the churchyard, not a tombstone, but a dedication. It bore Hannah's name, carved clean and bold, the woman who spoke the truth. He whispered, "We didn't come to chase evil. We came to protect what's right. And this time, we did." Rex let out a soft bark, then turned his head toward the village, where golden lights had begun to flicker in each little home, like the first sparks of a new chapter just waiting to be written. That afternoon, as the golden glow of dusk spread gently across the weathered rooftops of the village, David sat on the wooden bench outside Hannah's cottage. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh grass through the air. Rex lay beside him, head resting on David's foot, his eyes calm, almost sleepy, the kind of peace earned only after a storm. Hannah stepped out of the house with 2 cups of hot tea. She sat beside David and offered him a quiet smile. The kind of smile he once feared might never return to her face after everything she'd endured. "Did you ever think it would end like this?" Hannah asked, her voice as light as the wind. David was quiet for a moment. "I never thought I'd come to this village," he replied. "And I definitely never thought I'd be dragged into a battle with a crooked priest, by a dog." They laughed, and in that laughter, echoing between scars and fading memories, was the sound of healing. A week later, in the village square, the townspeople gathered to unveil a new memorial in front of the church. This time, instead of a solemn saint frozen in stone, the sculpture was simple: a man crouched low, listening closely to a dog barking into the unknown. Beneath it, an inscription read, "Truth doesn't always come from man. Sometimes, it comes from loyalty." Children ran around Rex, tossing balls, hugging him, petting him like a living symbol of hope. The adults, too, looked at David with a quiet reverence, no longer an outsider, but a part of this place, of its story, its soul. Father Mary, the new priest, held her first prayer gathering in near silence. She began with a single sentence that brought the crowd to stillness. "We don't pray to forget the past. We pray for the courage to face it." Hannah sat in the front pew, fingers lightly gripping the old Bible she once feared to look at. David sat beside her, and Rex, as always, lay at the front of the altar. No barking, no growling, just stillness, as if, finally, he too was at peace. After the service, Hannah turned to David. "You once said you were just passing through. Are you still planning to keep going?" David looked at her for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. "There are places you pass through. And then there are places you choose to stay." She smiled, eyes glassy with emotion. Rex let out a soft bark, as if agreeing. That evening, in the warm kitchen bathed in the soft yellow light above the table, Hannah, David, and Rex sat together. No more tears, no more doubt, just laughter, the clink of dishes, and the quiet rhythm of hearts finally beating in a home reborn from the shadows. Outside, the wind swept once more through the trees. But this time, it didn't carry secrets. It carried the quiet whisper of freedom.